Yeah, this is a paper about heterodox conspiracy theory. Some conspiracy theory theorists would consider this a pleonasm, arguing that all conspiracy theories are by definition heterodox. Others, however, allow for the possibility of orthodox conspiracy theories, such as the official story of 9/11, which explains the events in terms of the conspiracy by a small group of Islamists. But whether you belong to the first or the second group of conspiracy theory theorists, and I don't want to take sides in this conceptual dispute in this paper, you will probably agree that heterodox ideas face an uphill battle, as David Bernhardt put it in the recent article, and that the same is true of conspiracy theories insofar as they are a subset of heterodox ideas. Now, it is one thing for heterodox conspiracy theories to face an uphill battle. Whether and to what extent this should be the case is another matter. Some authors have gone so far as to argue that heterodox conspiracy theories should be generally dismissed, and that it is precisely their heterodox status that justifies such a dismissive stance. For example, Dustin McBrayer has recently defended the principle of common consent and argued that heterodox conspiracy theories are epistemically defective because they violate this principle. He writes, "It is usually reasonable to dismiss heterodox conspiracy theories, but why? What justifies this dismissal? It's not appeals to epistemic principles about simplicity, falsification, available evidence, etc., that explain why it's reasonable to go with the story held by the majority over the minority conspiracy theory. Instead, you trust the majority opinion and dismiss the conspiracy theorists as crackpots. Of course, particularists will strongly object to such an assessment, arguing that conspiracy theories, whether heterodox or orthodox, should not be dismissed before the relevant evidence has been carefully examined. But even particularists will probably concede that proponents of heterodox conspiracies have a special epistemic burden to bear. For example, Curtis Hagen states that anyone defending a counter-narrative conspiracy theory faces the added burden of proof to overcome the presumption in favor of the already dominant official account. Although he hastens to add that this does not imply that this burden can never be met. The main aim of this paper is to examine this particular epistemic burden more closely. Drawing on the literature on peer disagreement, genealogical debunking arguments, and related philosophical debates, I focus in particular on the question of whether and under what conditions it can be rational to defend heterodox conspiracy theories and argue that what I will call theories of error play a crucial role in this context. First, however, some terminological clarifications regarding my use of the term heterodox are important. The term heterodoxy is derived from the ancient Greek terms heteros, meaning other or different, and doxa, meaning belief or popular belief. So as a first approximation, we could say that to have a heterodox belief is to have a belief that deviates from a widely held or dominant or orthodox belief. However, this preliminary characterization needs a number of refinements. A first complication is that we need to relativize the concepts of orthodox and heterodox beliefs in relation to social contexts or groups. For what is the dominant view in one context or group, for example, country, maybe a minority view in another. Moreover, majorities can be more or less strong. It makes a difference whether the dominant view is supported by an overwhelming consensus or merely by a simple majority. Another point is the following. There seem to be cases where a dominant view does not intuitively correspond to what the majority of people in the group believe. For example, In cases of what has been called pluralistic ignorance, the members of the group predominantly believe that P, but mistakenly assume that the other members of the group do not believe that P. In such situations, it is possible that the members will tend to publicly endorse the view that non-P against their own conviction in order to conform to what they perceive to be the consensus. And I suggest that we should then call non-P the orthodox view in the group. More generally, this consideration suggests that we should define the notion of an orthodox view in a group not as the view that is predominantly believed in that group, but as the view that is predominantly endorsed or publicly expressed, although in many situations these two notions will certainly coincide. Another complication is that there may, but need not, be some sort of epistemic division of labor in determining what is the orthodox or dominant view in a group G, in the sense that there may be a subgroup S, such as the journalists, politicians, experts, etc., such that if the members of S predominantly express or endorse the view that P, then P is the orthodox view in G. The notion of an orthodox view characterized in this way is similar to, but different from, David Cody's notion of an official story, which he defines as a version of events propagated by an institution which has power to influence what is widely believed at a particular time and place. One difference is that I think we should allow for the possibility that there may be an orthodox view in a group, even if there are no institutions or no division of epistemic labor at all in the group. A final refinement is that it may be more appropriate to use a framework that employs credences or degrees of belief instead of all or nothing beliefs. We can then understand heterodoxy as a concept of doxastic deviation, implying that an agent's epistemic stance can be more or less heterodox. More specifically, one can have a heterodox stance by having a lower degree of belief in a proposition than the degree that is predominantly publicly expressed and accurate by the relevant members of the group in question. An example is distrust of the official narrative of 9/11. And note that greater mistrust does not necessarily imply that one is convinced that the narrative is false. Or one can have a heterodox stance on an alternative narrative by having a higher degree of belief in that narrative than the degree that is predominantly publicly expressed as accurate by the relevant members in the group in question. An example of this is having a higher degree of belief in an inside job conspiracy theory. And again, having a higher degree of belief in an inside job conspiracy theory does not imply full belief in that. Putting all this together, we can say that the attitude of a subject S towards a proposition P is heterodox to the extent that S's degree of belief deviates from the degree that is predominantly publicly expressed as accurate by the relevant members of the group in question, and the stronger the majority that supports the dominant view. Let us now turn to more normative questions by asking what epistemic stance one should take towards heterodox and orthodox view. Is there such a thing as a presumption in favor of the orthodoxy? There may be a number of lines of argument that might support such a conclusion. For example, one might invoke wisdom of crowds arguments, or non-reductionism in the epistemology of testimony, or the conciliationist view in the philosophy of peer disagreement. Focusing on the latter, one might argue that if another person holds a contrary belief, then this is defeasible higher order evidence against one's own belief, which may outweigh one's first order evidence and require a weakening of one's degree of belief. And the more people who disagree with you, the stronger the higher order evidence you have. As Thomas Kelly writes, as the number of peers increases, peer opinion counts for progressively more in determining what it is reasonable for the peers to believe. At some point, when the number of peers grows large enough, the higher order psychological evidence will swamp the first order evidence into virtual insignificance. With this in mind, it may seem natural to establish a principle like McBrayor's principle of common consent mentioned at the beginning, which states that if S knows that others believe that P, then this fact gives S a reason to believe that P. And similar principles have been introduced by other epistemologists, such as Simon Barker, who advocates what he calls a principle of collective superiority. If such principles are correct, one might indeed conclude that there is a presumption in favor of orthodox positions. Also, perhaps a case could be made for adding heterodoxy to the list discussed by M. Dentit of characteristics that can generate type 1 or weak suspicion against a conspiracy theory if it exhibits one of them. What do these considerations imply for how we should evaluate heterodox ideas in general and heterodox conspiracy theories in particular? When people hold heterodox positions, are they rightly accused of irrationality or epistemic arrogance for pretending to know things better than everyone else? This is certainly a common accusation against conspiracy theorists. For example, Alan Hazlitt argues that conspiracy theorists are intellectually arrogant and disguise their arrogance as humility. As I will argue, however, it is possible for proponents of heterodox views to counter such charges of irrationality or epistemic arrogance under certain conditions. One can accept a general presumption in favor of the orthodoxy, while acknowledging the possibility that in certain circumstances it may be reasonable to remain steadfast in one's heterodox position. In particular, I will argue that theories of error play an important role in this context. As the term is used by some authors in the debate on peer disagreement, for example, Michael Bergman, a theory of error is a theory that explains how or why another person arrived at a particular belief that they hold to be true, even though it is false. Such a theory can be constructed by providing a truth-mooting genealogy of the belief in question, where a truth-mooting genealogy is one where the truth of the belief that is being explained does not play a role in generating that belief, nor does the genealogy probabilify the proposition it expresses. However, if we are to apply this notion to orthodox views, we need to remember that we have characterized the notion of an orthodox view as a view that is predominantly expressed or endorsed in a group, which may but need not necessarily be identical with the view that is predominantly believed. Accordingly, to establish a theory of error for an orthodox view is to establish that a predominantly endorsed view has emerged with the involvement of processes that are not truth-tracking. Let me illustrate the function of a theory of error with a simple example. Consider the classic Asch experiment. The experiment is usually interpreted as proving the power of peer pressure. However, it can also be interpreted in a way that is more charitable to the subjects. Imagine that you are in the situation of Asch subjects. You have first order perceptual evidence that line B is the same length as the target line. On the other hand, you hear the other 7 people in the room give answer A. This is higher order evidence for you that this is the correct answer and that answer B is incorrect. In general, it is reasonable to consider both one's first order and higher order evidence, and in cases of conflict, it is necessary to weigh them. And given that first order evidence can be just as misleading as higher order evidence, After all, our senses are imperfect. We can be subject to sensory illusions, etc. It may not be irrational at all to weigh one's higher order evidence more heavily than one's first order evidence. A significant number of Ash subjects did just that, or at least that is how the experiment could be interpreted. But now consider what would have happened if these subjects had a good theory of error. For example, the theory that the other people present were just actors paid by the experimenter to give misleading testimony, which is actually a kind of conspiracy theory. They would then have had a defeater for their higher order evidence, allowing them to rely on their first order evidence and get the right result. This example illustrates one of the central functions of theories of error: to debunk misleading higher order evidence and give the possibly contradictory first order evidence its due. At this point, it is worth briefly considering the possible relationships between heterodox positions and the corresponding theories of error. As shown in the table, a heterodox position may or may not a heterodox position may or may not be or involve a conspiracy theory, and the corresponding theory of error may or may not itself be or involve a conspiracy theory. In the toy example just discussed, we have a heterodox position that is not a conspiracy theory, namely line B is as long as the target line, and a conspiracy theory of error, and a corresponding theory of error that is a kind of conspiracy theory, namely the other people are being paid by the experimenter to give a wrong answer. However, the other three combinations are also possible, can also be realized. For example, a theory of error that is not a conspiracy theory could be a theory that explains the error on the side of the orthodoxy by a collective bias. The intermediate conclusion so far is that one can rationally hold one's heterodox position if one has a good theory of error. This raises the question of what constitutes a good theory of error. The problem is that believing a bad theory of error can have very problematic consequences. In such a case, you may have valuable higher order evidence, but you reject it and end up with a false heterodox position. In general, a good theory of error must itself be evidence-based and be capable of making an epistemic asymmetry plausible. It must make plausible why the holder of the heterodox view is in a better epistemic position than the many other people who hold the orthodox view. More specifically, a good theory of error invokes a mechanism capable of explaining why people might come to endorse a false proposition. We might call this the explanatory component. But the explanatory component is not enough. To see this, consider again the example just mentioned. If you are one of Ash's subjects, you might suspect maybe there is a conspiracy between the experimenter and the other subjects. Maybe the experimenter is paying them to trick me. That would explain why they give misleading testimony. But unless you have some concrete reason to believe that there is such a conspiracy, this remains pure speculation. So what we need in addition to the explanatory component is something we might call the evidence component. A good theory of error cites evidence that shows that the mechanism invoked really does operate on the side of the people who endorse the orthodox view, while it does not operate on your own heterodox side. In the remainder of the paper, I would like to look more closely at some of the possible mechanisms and strategies that defenders of heterodox position might use to demonstrate the epistemic asymmetry in favor of their position. Perhaps the most straightforward possibility is that the defender of a heterodox proposition P has crucial first order evidence for P that the defenders of the orthodox view lack. For example, if you are the only eyewitness to a conspiracy, then you have insider information on the basis of which it is rational to believe the conspiracy theory in question, even though most other people reject it. The theory of error you can construct in this case is almost trivial. People don't normally believe propositions unless they have sufficient evidence to do so. This is the mechanism you can invoke. And since you have the crucial piece of evidence, and you know that others lack it because you are the only eyewitness, you believe the true conspiracy theory and other people don't. Now, it is probably quite rare to have such insider information. Conspiracy theorists, for example, don't usually appeal to evidence that only they possess, but to publicly available evidence. Can it still be reasonable to hold a heterodox view? I think the answer is yes, given the possibility of other relevant epistemic asymmetries. One such asymmetry concerns the evaluation and assessment of the available evidence. Suppose, for example, that there is a body of publicly available evidence for and against a particular conspiracy theory. Given this evidence, what is the accurate degree of belief regarding the proposition that this conspiracy theory is true? As a number of conspiracy theory theorists have observed, the answer a subject will give to such a question depends on the subject's prior probabilities, which result from the subject's perception of the general prevalence of conspiracies in society. Now, prior probabilities can be more or less accurate, depending on how well they match the actual frequency of conspiracy theories. This suggests another mechanism that a proponent of a heterodox view might invoke. One possible explanation for an inappropriate orthodox view might be that its proponents started with inaccurate prior probabilities. And it may not be too difficult to find evidence to support the explanation. For example, one could simply ask those who reject the conspiracy theory in question what conspiracies in history they are aware of. Theories of error might also appeal to biases on the part of those defending the orthodox position. I will be now more brief now. Note that bias does not necessarily have to be psychological. It can also be social or collective in nature. For example, the social composition of a group, for example, the group of journalists or whatever group determines the orthodox view, may be one-sided, which may lead that group to reach a majority position that it would not have reached if it had been more diverse. Or theories of error might appeal to evidence suggesting that the majority of people are insincere or publicly endorse a certain degree of belief, even though they know it to be incorrect, as in the case of the Ash experiment discussed in the previous section. And there may be other mechanisms, strategy, and in some situations, there may be more than one mechanism at work. Let me conclude. As M. Denting writes in a recent article, we have at best only a sketch of how we might show that the conspiracy theory is warranted. I think that this paper can help to improve the situation by introducing the notion of a theory of error into the debate and trying to show that an important aspect of judging whether a heterodox conspiracy theory is warranted is to consider whether the conspiracy theory can be supported by a good theory of error. I have distinguished heterodox and orthodox positions and argued that an epistemic presumption in favor of the orthodox positions might be justified, for example, by appeals to the epistemology of disagreement. If a certain degree of belief in a proposition is predominantly publicly expressed as accurate by the relevant members of your group, this might be higher order evidence for you that this is the accurate degree of belief. However, if you have a good theory of error, you may have a defeater for this higher order evidence. To be good, theories of error must themselves be evidence-based. Allow me a final comment on the limits of my argument. I have focused on the question of when it might be reasonable for an individual to hold a heterodox epistemic position. What I have not discussed are the implications of heterodox positions for the quality of public discourse in general. It can be argued, for example, using Millian arguments, that even in cases where it is not rational for individuals to hold their heterodox positions, they do the community a favor by challenging dominant views and preventing them from becoming dogmas. That would require another paper. Here are my references, and thank you for your